Does God exist? Well, in the previous few presentations, we talked about, or at the introduction, I talked about four arguments. And in the previous presentations, we covered the first two arguments, which was the first cause argument, and the second one was the design argument. And now we're talking about the third argument, which is the moral argument, proving that God exists through reasoning. We use reasoning, we use logic, without having to resort to Bible scriptures. The moral law argument goes something like this, that we know that there are differences in laws or differences in our opinion or approach towards right or wrong between countries, between within a country, or between cultures within a country, or within societies, if you like, within a country. There are different laws that appear. There are different between countries. Abortion law, for instance, is an example. In some countries, it is against the law to abort a baby. In other countries, it is legal. And indeed, there are some countries that demand abortion. So there are different laws in different countries. But we know amongst all this, there are certain moral codes that are applicable universally, applicable to all countries, all tribe, all nation, all tongues, to everyone, regardless of where they come from and which culture and which tradition. An example might be to torture babies just for the fun of it is wrong, objectively wrong, regardless of whether you are in China, India, Malaysia, Singapore, USA, or European country, or in Russia, or indeed in Africa. Most, in fact, all sane human beings would know that it is wrong to simply torture babies for fun. You don't need laws to protect that or to enact that. You don't need social understanding or massive discussion. It is an inbuilt moral code in all sane human beings that torturing babies is, just for the fun of it, is wrong. That is your universal moral code. Then how can we explain this universal moral code that is so consistently present in all societies? Where does this universal moral code comes from? It has to come from somewhere that is not part of the system in itself. It has to come from somebody who's got the authority to issue and has the right and the rightful penalty to issue and police such a moral code. It's got to come from someone outside the system. It's got to come from a higher source that's not within the system. This higher source is the objective morality that we're talking about, that can only be created, provided, and policed by a powerful personal being called God. There's a Russian novelist called Fyodor Dostoevsky. He observed, and I quote, "If there is no immortality of the soul, there can be no virtue, and therefore everything is permissible." In other words, if God does not exist, or this higher objective moral giver does not exist as the foundation of morality, then anything goes. Well, this doesn't mean that atheists or other non-believers will necessarily act more immorally than believers. No, it doesn't mean that. But it does mean that we lose an objective basis by which to make moral judgment. If God does not exist, then we lose the right to judge the Nazis, for instance, and anyone else with whom we disagree morally, because we do not have a standard to judge that act, whether it's right or wrong. They can think they're right, we can think we're right, or we can think they're right, or they can think they're wrong. It becomes a very subjective moral judgment based on personal opinions and preferences. Without a higher law above humanity, who gets to decide the moral truth? If there is no greater source above human beings, then the existence of morality is an inexplicable illusion. Powerful words by this professor. So we're saying if God exists, then we have a ground, we have a standard upon which we can define something that is right or wrong, that is not subjected to individual opinions or preferences. We ought to be truthful because God is true and faithful. We ought to do loving acts because God is love. Morality stems from the character and nature of God, and it's binding on His creation. The existence of this moral law, this universal moral law, can only point to one moral law giver. He exists beyond humanity. Only God's existence and a character can properly account for this objective moral law that applies universally. Well, there are counter-arguments to this, of course, but let's explore that. The counter-arguments suggest that morality can exist independent of this moral lawgiver called God. They contend that they don't need a God in order to be good or to be evil. Yet, if you think about this thought presents a problem in itself. Think about this. How do you define good or evil without a transcendent moral standards? In other words, evil, for example, is traditionally being understood as the perversion of good or a privation of good or the inexistence of good. Or you can say, for example, how do you know a line is crooked if you don't have a straight line, if you don't have a standard that is non-changing, that it is correct to compare that line with? You wouldn't know you have a crooked line until you have a straight line. Similarly, you wouldn't know there is evil. If you say something is evil, something is bad, you wouldn't know that until you can compare with a standard that is non-changing, a standard that is good in the first place. It's only with the presence of good that you can define a situation that is evil. If there is no God, there is no moral giver, then there is no standard. Without this standard, we all are left to figure out the meaning of good for ourselves, and the concept of objective good disappears. In other words, in this so-called atheistic world, based on its naturalistic or naturalism concept of being an individual, what is good for me, and if it's not good for you, that is fine. If we subscribe to that, then society cannot work, because if I feel like stealing something from you, I like your stuff, I'll just simply go to your home and steal stuff from you because I feel good about it. I do not have to subject myself to a higher standard. I just need to define whatever I do as good. So I need to take your car, it feels good, I will just do it. How would society be like, or what would society be like based on that standard of subjective morality? What would society be without this universal moral law that is provided by a moral lawgiver called God. Given that, given that universally recognized existence of some sort of a moral law, moral, non-changing moral law, points to a strong reason for the existence of the Almighty God. Consider this very simple argument. If objective morality exists or moral exists, if a non changing standard of moral good and bad exists, God must exist. Objective moral values exist, therefore, God must exist. We know that objective moral values do exist. We know, you and I know that torturing babies for fun is not right. We know that universal moral law exists. We don't need to persuade people, for example, what we just said about torturing babies was wrong. You don't need to persuade people. It's just an innate, inbuilt knowledge. All reasonable people would know that, or reasonably sane people would know that. Therefore, since moral values do exist, then God must exist, the God who is the moral lawgiver. This moral law argument provides a strong defense of the assertion that the God of moral character does exist